The Thieves-In-Law were the elite of the criminal world. Their origins trace back to before the Soviet era, one of the most total systems of control in human history. And these people declared war not just on the Soviet Union, but on the very idea of society and justice. And they're still operating to this day. This is their story. My name is Sandra, and this channel covers the history and culture of the Caucasus with a thread of ADHD throughout it. So if that resonates with you, subscribe. Let's begin. Of course, we start with Russia. During the Tsarist rule, people were stealing horses and being utter menaces to society. At the time, horses were the moneymakers for many rural populations. Having them stolen was a financial and likely an actual death sentence for these people. They weren't parting with them easily. So criminals had to set up sophisticated rackets to steal horses, hide them, and sell them so far away that no one would be able to find them again. This, of course, led to a lot of violent encounters, fear, and utter chaos. Eventually, those horse bandits added other offerings to the menu. They would sometimes give villagers the option to pay them in order for their horses to be left alone. And over time, these criminals realized that they were kindred spirits and collectivized, becoming known as artels. They were little criminal groups that supported each other, the prototype for the Thieves-In-Law. Next, the Bolsheviks. They were a socialist group in the 20th century that had this utopian idea for humanity. However, they quite literally slaughtered any and everyone who did or didn't agree with their mission, and this time became known as the Red Terror. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, they created their secret police force called the Cheka that tortured, killed, and imprisoned many people. This time of chaotic upheaval led to people not only just living in fear, but lacking basic necessities to live and the means to obtain them. So naturally, black markets began to form. And of course, criminals were all over that. Thus, enemies of the state. All of these factors compounded, resulting in increased animosity and distrust for the government. Among the prisoners were criminals, and once they were all grouped together, finally, in one place, they made their world official. Their own morals, rules, systems, norms, justice, hierarchies. And Stalin eventually became the leader of the Union and declared war on the criminal world and expanded the Gulags, a prison system known for its cruelty. In these prison camps, the criminals' code codified. Their power grew, and the Thieves-In-Law that we know today was birthed. With the insecurity and disillusionment that people were experiencing under the government, many increasingly put their trust and admiration toward this newly formed ideology of the criminal underworld. To understand why they were powerful, we need to have some idea on how they operated. First, what is a thief-in-law? Well, in Russian, it's called a vory zakone. They weren't the mafia as many of us may visualize them today. They were sort of like the United Nations, but for the criminal world. This means that they were composed of different criminal groups, not just one organization in particular. They were known as the bratva, or brotherhood. To obtain the rank of a thief-in-law, a man had to be crowned. Crowning was a ceremony where at least 2 or 3 vory, or thieves, would hold a meeting, or skotka, where they would discuss the criminal that was up for nomination and decide if he was vory material. If they all agreed, the criminal had to take an oath, by which some accounts say originally went like this. As a young lad, I set foot on the road of a thief's life. I swear before the thieves who are at this meeting to be a worthy thief and not to fall for any trick of the members of the Cheka. The new vory would be embraced, and he was officially in the ranks of the elite. In some records, there was even some ritualistic bloodletting, like he would have his finger cut or something. These crownings would often occur in prison systems away from the eyesight of the guards. And that status traveled with the individual wherever he went, giving him respect among people who recognized the criminal world. Ethnicity, national origin, native language, none of that mattered. A vory was a vory and was respected as such. The vory had a lot of rules with very serious consequences if violated. Originally, they had to operate solely within the criminal world and leave innocent people alone. They couldn't own property. The prison was considered their home. They couldn't be murderers, as thieves preferred dialogue over bloodshedding to solve conflict. But if there was a murder, the thief would have to give an account to other vory who would determine if it was justified or not. They could never work a legitimate job. Everything they had to come from thievery. And what they stole would go into the obshak, which was a communal fund for the entire criminal world, just like the artels of their horse bandit predecessors. If they were asked by the authorities if they were a thief, they had to say yes. Denial would result in expulsion from the group and possibly more drastic consequences. They had to defend their honor. No one could disrespect them. They couldn't get married, although they could have lovers. A family was a luxury reserved for ordinary people, not thieves. However, if they did have a family, the family was to mean nothing to them, or at least couldn't come before the bratva, because to them, family and property were liabilities. They could never lie to each other. They couldn't hit each other or strike each other. They couldn't touch anything that a gay man, or patuk, which in English means rooster, touched. And there were a number of rules on how they had to interact in this space with a gay man. Yet, they could have sex with men as long as they were in the active homosexual or top position and not the bottom position or passive homosexual position. But I mean, either way, that's gay. Furthermore, they couldn't cooperate with authorities in any way or accept anything from them. This means that in prison, their code required them to refuse any job that they were assigned to do or accept anything given to them, even tea, which by one account reportedly got one thief in a whole heap of trouble. There were many other rules, but the last one I'll mention is this: how women were treated. Those guys did not like women very much, or at least in the context of the code. But there were a number of vory who questioned not only this, but a lot of the different rules. So it wasn't a homogenous thinking pattern. And although they had tattoos of the Virgin Mary and women on their bodies and said respectful things about their mothers, the reality is it was pretty much all symbolic, and they weren't actually speaking about real women or their mothers. For them, family was a weakness. Their wives were simply bodies that they owned, used, and at times was just the mother of their children, who didn't get that much attention from their fathers either. She wasn't normally allowed to have relationships with people outside of the criminal world, and she was expected to be concerned with the welfare of her man who was in prison. And if directed, she was to fulfill the needs of other thieves. Family was nothing to the code. Prison didn't give them that much access to women anyways, because you see, during the Soviet era, the thieves' power was largely concentrated in the gulags. That was their kingdom. And one of their key responsibilities was to maintain order inside the prisons. They would steal from others, crown new vory, settle disputes, and communicate with their network inside and outside of the prison system. The obshak would supply those who were in prison. The thief's presence was so huge in the prison system that sometimes some people would deliberately get arrested in order to replace a thief who was getting ready to come out of the prisons. And they even continued that into the modern day. Very committed. You may also be surprised to know that a thief's power didn't necessarily come from him being the most violent or the loudest. In fact, it came off the strength of his title. He just needed to be a vor, as someone's reputation was already at a base level communicated with that status. If there was dirty work to be done, his subordinates would do it. Outside of prisons, thieves-in-laws were viewed as Robin Hoods, as they would steal from the rich or corrupt and lived in unideal circumstances. And at times they would help other people. Strict consequences also helped to keep them in line. If there was a dispute or conflicts, criminals would have to present their case before a court of vory, who would deal out resolutions and judgments. These punishments could include that a vor wasn't able to tell stories or boast, which was a huge hit to their ego. They could get slapped, expelled from the brotherhood, their status revoked, or even be killed. This was their lifestyle, their world, and their bodies told the stories. Tattoos on a thief's body communicated who he was. If you understood what the images meant, you could understand his whole criminal history without ever speaking a word to him. The star tattoo is the most notable of the vory. Someone having that tattoo without having earned it was liable to corrective action. Although the idea was that the thieves-in-laws were equals, in reality there were ranks and varying levels of respect. Still, the setup of the organization was very secretive, very powerful, and very valuable. You're still here? That's amazing. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. Also, I'm working on a guide that brings all of these lessons that I learned from this region into a clear framework that's like nothing you've seen before. Its purpose is to help people who are misfits, with a particular focus on people with high-functioning autism and ADHD, turn their disadvantages into advantages immediately. If that's something you need, the link to sign up for the waitlist is in the description and pinned comments, and you'll be the first to know when it's available. Sign up for that, and let's continue this video. The Thieves-In-Law were doing their thing for quite a while. That is, until World War II. The Axis power had gained substantial amounts of ground in the Soviet Union in the early stages of the war. Manpower was needed. So Stalin looked to the prisons where there was a plethora of able-bodied men. He made them an offer. Anyone who took up arms to defend the motherland would gain their freedom at the end of the war, but with many caveats. Many vory refused the offer as it violated the code, prohibiting them from taking up weapons and fighting for a government. However, some broke the code. They fought and wound right back up in the gulags after their victory, because you see, Stalin was a very shiesty man. This time there were even more prisoners, and the vory didn't forget their treachery. There were consequences for violating the code, but this time things wouldn't go the way that they normally would have gone. You see, these men actually went to war. They actually saw the horrors of war. They actually fought and had a perspective and internal shift. Men whose strength came from commanding a prison didn't intimidate them nearly the same as before. So a war broke out between the vory and the so-called suki. Suki was what the thieves called men who went to war and violated the code. It literally means the bitches. And the conflict that broke out between them in the gulags became known as the Suka Wars, or bitch wars. The Suki broke the code not only because they had gone to war, but by working and cooperating with prison officials. The vory were intent on crushing them. The prison officials, taking advantage of the situation, even supplied weapons to the Suki in order for them to crush the vory. This put the vory at an extreme disadvantage, but not in all cases. So in camps that were dominated by vory, the Suki were in trouble. Camps dominated by the Suki, the vory were in trouble. This war went on for almost a decade, and by the end of it, thousands of people had died. The vory were almost wiped out entirely, and prison culture had a dramatic shift. In order to survive, the Thieves-In-Law finally accepted that changes were needed for this new era. Meetings were held, people fought, and there was a break in the criminal world. From this, a new generation of the code emerged. In the 1970s, a vory laid out the reality of the situation, proposed a vision for the Brotherhood's future, and died before seeing it realized. His name was Anatoly Cherkasov. At a Skoka in Kiev, his proposals included doing away with the rule that a vory had to be in prison in order to be one, and a dual system of operation where a vory stayed outside of the prison to gain ground for the Brotherhood while maintaining watchers inside of the prison. This was a shock to the system, but over time, people came around to the idea, especially the young vory. The idea was, why would they be the only truth tellers in a world of deceit? Because that would only lead to their extermination. They were dying out because of the code. So changes were made. The vory updated to allow for cooperation with the legitimate world for the benefit of the Bratva. They taxed the underworld, engaged in corruption, had families, obtained wealth, held positions of authority, and got jobs. The vory had graduated from being completely insulated to engaging with the rest of the world. Their system was very sophisticated, quite literally a society within a society. Even the governing authorities, a number of whom were in cahoots with the vory, they were corrupt, of course, knew that in certain situations or places, they had no power, as that was Thieves' territory. Fast forward a bit in time, and this trend only progressed. Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, wasn't nearly as treacherous as his predecessors. He introduced sweeping liberal policies, including more freedom of speech, private enterprise, and democratization, things that were crushed and led to people actually dying before. With this new freedom and opportunities just for the ordinary person, criminals were also presented with new opportunities. They could make money by offering protective services, collecting payments, and offering connections. Moreover, they could own their own enterprises. However, their crimes also became more sinister, resembling the oppression and violence that the Bratva originally stood against: human trafficking, drugs, murder, striking their own, and terrorizing innocents. The 1990s was a particularly chaotic time all over the post-Soviet world. Criminals and legitimate governments were no longer distinguishable. Wars kicked off, entire families were murdered, people were oppressed again. And not all, but a number of these positions of authority were actually held by crowned thieves. A famous example of this is Jaba Ioseliani. He was not only a thief-in-law, but a writer, a professor, a politician, and the founder of a paramilitary group called the Mkhedrioni. They terrorized Georgia, participated in the Caucasus War, and overthrew Georgia's first democratically elected president right after they gained independence from the Soviet Union. If you want to know more about that, I made a video all about it called the Tbilisi Civil War Simplified. You can go check that out to learn more. The vory were still working together, still conducting meetings, and still trying to maintain the brotherhood. However, greed and power entered the equation. Many of the younger vory experienced this new age of opportunity, and money got their loyalty over the brotherhood and the ideals of the founding vory. This led to the organization operating in a gray area and even civil wars within the groups. At the same time, other criminals were also taking advantage of the situation with little, if any, respect to the code. This presented a new set of challenges as the vory's power moved away from respect and more towards who could spill whose blood first. Many innocent people became casualties at this time. As time passed and nations became somewhat stabilized, formal action by governments began to be taken to bring down the criminal underworld. This led to an increased dispersal of the Thieves-In-Law and other criminal networks beyond the post-Soviet nations into the wider world. To this day, they are still in operation. Although not really spoken of by name in the Western world, a quick Google search will let you know that they are still going. And while some vory still hold on to the old school way of thinking, they're considered relics. The vory with power now have money in addition to influence. Whereas the original vory was committed to a life of poverty for the good of the group, The criminal elite now are flexing and living lavishly. However, you aren't likely to see the big bosses out and about. They're still criminals and they're still wanted, and a number of them are unknown. But you may have crossed paths with their underlings from time to time without ever having a clue. Their values changed. The title stayed the same. This is an extremely fascinating topic for me, and I actually respect a lot of aspects of the Thieves-In-Law. They actually help me in my personal life. So if you want to know a little bit about that, you can watch the video I just made before this one on that. And the essence of them I understand on a personal level. What does one do when the systems that are supposed to protect you and produce justice are the same ones oppressing you? What happens when the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones plotting your demise? What do you do other than what the vory of zakone did in essence? Let me know. The Thieves-In-Law, although they started in the gulags of Russia, were not solely composed of Russians. They included people all across the Soviet Union and eventually a few outliers. The men who rebuilt the vory after the wars, who dominated it for decades, who carried its code into the post-Soviet world, they weren't Russian. At least a lot of them weren't. And in the next video, we're going to discuss something that doesn't get spoken about a lot. How the code the Russians built inside the Gulag was actually older than the Gulag itself. Where? In the Caucasus. That was mad corny. And what that tells us about why these Caucasian men, not Russians, but Caucasian men, ran the underworld for as long as they did. So be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, engage with me, all right, and be ready for the next video. All right, peace.